So this week I'm going to cover another carburetor. You probably recognize this one. This is probably the most common carburetor, most used aftermarket performance carburetor in history. It's a Holley 4160 and 600 CFM. So this is a very old, over-the-counter replacement carburetor. I don't know the actual date of it, but it is a standard 4160. And they're a great little carburetor. Really like these things. Lots of good things about them. A couple minor things you need to be aware of when you're tuning them. But this one's going to come apart. I'm going to clean it up a little bit, and I'll point out some of the good parts about it and some of the not so good parts about it. Some of the things I like about it, some of the things I don't like about it. So let's tear into it. First thing I'll do is go ahead and pull the primary bowl off. Now, one of the things I like about these carburetors is the way the float bowls are kind of hanging out in space in air. And that's useful because, for two reasons. One, if you live in a very hot climate, your fuel bowl isn't bolted to the intake manifold. Helps keep the fuel cool. And the second reason is kind of an abstract of that, is if you keep your fuel cool, your engine will perform better. Cooler fuel is typically more horsepower. So cool fuel is a good thing. I'll pull this fuel transfer tube out of the way. So you'll notice this is a single inlet carburetor. Most 4160s, or maybe all of them, are. Got one fuel line coming in. We have a transfer tube sealed with an O-ring that transfers fuel to the rear float bowl. So that's how that works. This is a typical side hung float. So needle and seats on the side of the bowl. You can switch one of these over to what's known as a center hung float, where needle and seat are in the center of the bowl. If you do that, you have to put a dual fuel inlet to feed both fuel bowls. You notice this one doesn't have the hole for the transfer tube, like this one does. So, this is the heart and soul of a Holley carburetor right here. This is the metering block. It's kind of cool that what Holley did, because all the calculations for fuel control are done right here. So we have our jets, we have our power valve, and all these passages. Got well tubes drilled in from the top, and pretty slick. So you can change your metering block and completely change the way the carburetor performs. So jets, this one's actually wearing pretty tiny jets at the moment. I take that back, it's got 67s in it, which is a pretty good sized jet. I think it came with much smaller jets, 61s perhaps. Alright, I'm going to pop that power valve out real quick. Power valve on a Holley, just like any other carburetor, is tunable. And there's several different methods to tune it. Right off the bat, you can see a number there. So that 4.5 signifies 4.5 inches of vacuum. So that's the vacuum level at which this thing opens and starts supplying extra fuel. I've got a couple more examples here. Here's another one. And that's a 6.5. So that would indicate this one would open at 6.5 inches of mercury. I think that's probably all I have at the moment. Yes. But you can get many different power valves. And the way that you choose the power valve, there's no magic formula, because the power valve choice is going to depend on a whole lot of factors: vehicle weight, engine size, main jetting. So for instance, if you put extremely small main jets in your carburetor and the fuel mixture is close to stoichiometric, or even maybe slightly leaner than stoichiometric, let's say you're cruising down the freeway at 15 to 1, which probably wouldn't hurt anything until you get in the throttle. Once you get in the throttle, you want a richer fuel mixture. But if you're cruising at 15 to 1, as you tip in the throttle, the main jet is going to lean out. As the vacuum in the intake drops, it will typically lean out on most carburetors that I've found. So in that case, you would want a power valve that would come in a little bit earlier. So you'd want a higher number. Let's say a 9.5 power valve. And you got to factor all that in. When you're cruising down the freeway, what's your vacuum reading? Is the engine cruising at 13 inches of vacuum? Is the engine cruising at 8 inches of vacuum? Because you'll choose your main jet and then your power valve according to that more than anything else. So you got to figure out what's your engine like? Where is their cruise at? And once you figure out where it cruises at, so let's say you decide that you want your engine to cruise at 14 to 1, and you pick a jet and it cruises at 14 to 1 at 70 miles an hour, and you start tipping in the throttle to pass somebody and it leans out to 16 to 1. Well, you'd want your power valve to kick in before that would happen. So really takes some sort of feedback. So a wideband fuel air meter that you can look at while you're driving, and then a vacuum gauge to see where all this stuff is happening. So that's how you pick a power valve. You want the engine, as you increase the throttle settings and the vacuum drops, you want the air-fuel ratio to steadily get richer. And you want to end up at about 13 to 1, 12.5 or 13 to 1, anywhere from like 3/4 throttle all the way to wide open throttle. And that's just to keep the pistons from overheating and burning and melting. So lean mixtures can kill pistons. Piston's the weak link in an engine when it comes to heat. So anything over 1200 degrees and you can take out a piston. So we don't want that to happen. So 12.5 to 1, 13 to 1 at moderate high throttle settings will save the pistons. And remember also that there's no perfect intake manifold. And as you get racier and racier with intakes, as the runners get bigger, as the plenum gets bigger, typically what happens is the fuel distribution gets worse, especially at idle and part throttle, because the racy intake slows the air down at idle and part throttle. And slow air through an intake is a recipe for disaster when it comes to fuel distribution, because the fuel, instead of getting transferred quickly to the cylinder, will puddle in the bottom of the runner, it'll puddle in the bottom of the plenum, and then run whichever way it wants to, whichever way gravity takes it. And you can get severe fuel distribution issues with intakes that have bigger plenums and bigger runners. So because of that, if you have a wideband sensor in your exhaust and you're watching the air-fuel ratio, what you're actually seeing is an average of all the cylinders. So if you're reading 14.7 to 1 at cruise, you have some cylinders that are richer than that and some that are leaner than that. So you have to be careful. Now, a factory intake will typically be better because it'll have smaller runners, a smaller plenum. Smaller plenum really helps, because as soon as the air-fuel mixture gets into the plenum, it's already in a runner. It has no time to just lag and hang there. It's got to get into a runner pretty quickly because there's not a lot of plenum volume for it to be stagnant. And that's the trait of an intake that has good fuel distribution. The air is always good, but the fuel is what is the issue, because the fuel is liquid, and it doesn't want to flow like the air does. Most of the intake manufacturers will do a lot of wet testing on a flow bench to find out what the problems are in wet flow distribution in the intake runners and try and minimize that with shapes of plenums and shapes of runners and plenum design. Lots of science in intakes, especially with wet intake designs. That's one of the reasons multi-port EFI is so superior to carburetors for fuel distribution. That's why they work so well for emissions, why they work so well for fuel economy, because you're squirting the fuel right into the cylinder head, and there's no chance of fuel distribution issues that way. But moving on, so here's the metering block for my 4160, and you can see underneath my power valve I have these little holes right here. Those are known as power valve channel restrictors. And depending on what carburetor you get, they're all different sizes. So this is a standard street carburetor. You can see that hole's pretty small. Here's another example of a metering block with the same holes. I believe that one might be even smaller. Just a little bit smaller. So this is more of an emissions fuel economy carburetor. So it's got a smaller power valve channel restrictor yet. So the reason I mention that is if you order a race-oriented carburetor, these power valve channel restrictors are going to be bigger. And when the power valve opens, it is going to dump fuel. And the thing is going to be pig fat and get horrible fuel economy. And it's not easy to fix. What you have to do is you have to drill that passage out. If you want to work with this same metering block, you drill those passages out and you tap them and you put screw-in restrictors in it, and you can tailor how much fuel the power valve adds to the circuit. So the vacuum reading tells you when it comes in, and those PVCRs, as they call them, determine how much fuel is added. So that's tunable. And really fancy carburetors will have screw-in restrictors in there already. So something to be aware of. And what else we got? Okay, this carburetor, like I said, was an over-the-counter performance replacement, and it's a few years old. And for a while, a lot of the manufacturers were using these cheap plastic floats. If you ever take a carburetor apart and see one of those, it goes in the trash. Make sure you convert to either a phenolic style float like that or a brass float. Either one will do, but if you're running forced induction, then you want the phenolic so it doesn't crush under pressure. Okay. I'll go ahead and pop the secondaries off. Secondary float bowl. Something else to mention is you'll notice that this one has plastic washers. That's an upgrade. They're reusable. You also notice that the float bowl has a blue gasket. Same thing. It's designed to be reusable. They won't tear typically when you take the carburetor float bowl off, so you can reuse them. The stock bolts usually have a paper washer. And one of the first upgrades I'll do to a Holley is I take those off and put the plastic ones on. Much easier to work with. And this is the secondary side. So you notice that one has a brass float. Yeah, how about that? Set that aside. So this side doesn't have a metering block. It's got what's known as a secondary plate. And this is kind of a cost-cutting measure, but it works just fine. You'll notice at the bottom we have these holes in the plate. That's what takes the place of the jet. And clever guys will drill those out oversized or maybe even put restrictors in there. Something else that you can do is you can actually convert to a metering block style carburetor. They sell kits to do that. So you can put a metering block with jets on the secondary side. The only consideration here is you're adding half an inch or 3/4 of an inch of space between both float bowls. So you'll need a longer tube, and that typically comes in the kit. Get rid of the plate entirely. Okay, other than that, well, here's our secondary vacuum diaphragm here. And of course the way that works is airflow through the primary creates a vacuum. The vacuum is sent to the top of this diaphragm, which opens up the secondaries on demand. So with high airflow through the primary, the secondaries will pop open, give you the extra air and fuel that you need. Completely tunable on a Holley. That's what the diaphragm looks like. This is the diaphragm out of this carburetor. And on the top of this, you have to pull this entire housing off to get to it. But once you pull the choke housing out of the way and you pull this diaphragm housing out of the way, 4 screws, pop that off, and there's a spring in there. You can change the spring to help determine when the secondaries come in. So by demand, if you have a big engine, you probably want a stronger spring. If you have a really small engine or a low compression engine, probably want a little weaker one to try and tailor that secondary to come in at the right time, at the right vacuum level. Some engines make more vacuum than others through the Venturi. Typically a bigger engine creates more of a vacuum signal to the secondary diaphragm than a small engine will. It makes sense. So this one has an automatic choke on it. You can use manual chokes. This is what a manual choke setup would look like. Goes in place of that. So I could take this off and put a manual choke on it if I wanted. I tend to prefer the automatic chokes. Seem to be easier to work with. Set it and forget it. Nicest thing about a Holley is you can adjust the floats externally. So you loosen the screw and put a wrench on this, and you can turn this, which effectively turns the needle and seat assembly and either raises it to increase fuel level in the bowl or lowers it to decrease fuel level in the bowl. And older Holleys had a sight plug that you would pop out and set the fuel level to the bottom of that. Newer ones have a see-through plug that you can just raise and lower until it gets to the bottom of that see-through glass or phenolic. I'm not sure what it's made of, but it's just a transparent material that you can actually see the fluid in the bowl, so kind of handy. On the bottom we have our accelerator pump. So 4 screws, accelerator pump diaphragm lives under there. There's also a small little plastic neoprene valve to give you one-way flow on that, so fuel doesn't go back in. And those are replaceable and come in the kits. This is what a diaphragm looks like. Pretty simple device. You step on the throttle. This one's as hard as a rock. Step on the throttle. The throttle level will move the diaphragm, and it will squirt fuel up into the squirters to keep the engine from bogging or stalling when you do that. While I'm here, let's look at the air bleeds. All carburetors have air bleeds. You can see right here, I have an air bleed. Here's an air bleed. And here's an air bleed, and there's an air bleed. 2 of those are for idle, and 2 of those are for the main jet. And air bleeds are to induce air into the main well tubes, and I will do another video at some point and explain how well tubes work and how fuel emulsifies and what the purpose of that is, but that's an in-depth discussion, so I'll save that for another day. But that's basically Holley. So what I like about them, the external fuel bowls keep the fuel cooler. And I live in the desert, so that's handy. It's pretty common when you shut your vehicle off, if you don't have a Holley, if you've got any of the carburetor that has the float bowl bolted directly to the intake manifold, that the fuel will just boil out of the float bowls. And on your next start, if you have a mechanical fuel pump, you'll have to crank it for a while to refill those bowls. So the Holleys are the best at this that I have found, because they've got it hanging out in space like that, and it keeps the fuel cooler. So less problems with that. And what else do I like about these Holleys? Very tunable, very easy to set fuel levels on. I'm not biased against them at all. I like them. I've run them many times. I've also run other carburetors. I like the Carters and the Edelbrocks. One of my favorite carburetors is a Rochester Quadrajet. I've worked on scads of those in my career, but this is a good performance replacement product, and I'll run this again someday. So what I don't like about Holleys is the advantage of this fuel bowl hanging out in space creates a disadvantage when you have to replace jets or do tuning on the car. When you pop this off, it's going to make a mess all over your intake. So that's a consideration. You have a nice shiny aluminum intake and you pop that float bowl off, fuel runs down on your nice shiny intake and can leave a stain. So it's one of the things I don't like about them. It's not the best carburetor, at least in this guise, for 4x4s, because of the way this jet and this well tube are spaced away from the booster. So these are your booster entrances right there. And there's just not enough space between this booster and the jet on the carburetor. So if you're running one of these on a 4x4 and it's running at angles like this, what will happen with this carburetor is fuel will slosh up through the main well tube and it'll run right in the booster and run in the engine and flood the engine out. It's just the side effect of this design. There's no way around it. Well, there is a way around it. If you have this issue and you still want to run this style of Holley, you run a Truck Avenger. Truck Avenger carburetors, what they did is they redesigned the carburetor, and inside the main well tube there's a check ball. And you'll know it if you have one of these, because you can take this and you can shake it and it will rattle. You can hear the check ball. And what's good about that is, as the fuel sloshes up through the main well tube and tries to pop out and go into the booster, the check valve or check ball will close and prevent that from happening. So Truck Avengers are a much better design for 4x4s. They do work. So that's one of the things, but this is just a standard 4160, so it doesn't have that feature. So what I do to minimize that is I run the fuel as low as I can in the bowl without creating drivability issues. And if you have to run a bigger jet to compensate for that low fuel level, you can do that. So, and they will work to some degree if you have to run them that way. The other thing you can do is buy off-road kits that will connect these two breathers, these vents, because fuel can slosh out of here also. But I think the biggest problem is fuel sloshing right out of the booster. And that seems to be the big issue with running these on four-wheel drives that I can see. Some guys say that the side-hung floats are better on a four-wheel drive. Some guys say that the center-hung floats are better on a four-wheel drive. My personal viewpoint is that the center-hungs are probably better. And for the simple reason is, if you turn this float sideways, it's going to shut off the fuel flow, not increase it. So we're trying to avoid flooding when we're off camber or we're in rough terrain. So there's only one direction that this thing can move to increase the fuel flow, and that's tipping away like that. So Maybe going down a hill or up a hill you might have a problem, but for side-to-side stuff and just rough terrain, I think the center hungs work better. But I have heard some guys say that these will work better on four-wheel drives. Hasn't been my experience, but to each their own. And I think that's about it. This is the absolute cheapest version of a 4160. These weren't very expensive, and I'm sure this was not a very expensive carburetor when it was new. And Holleys have tremendous variety, so I mean you can spend a lot more money for a much nicer carburetor, but you really probably don't need it. And if you're running a carb on the street, you really don't want to put a racy carburetor on it because you're going to run into that power valve restrictor issue being too big, and it's going to be pig fat, and it's not going to be good for the street at all. So that's about it. I think that covers everything. Like I said, I'm going to do another video pretty soon, and I'm going to explain how weld tubes work and get into some more complex tuning of things you can do, like drilling air bleeds and drilling and tapping these air bleeds and putting in screw-in restrictors. There's lots of things that you can do. You can mess with the weld tube staging. So, let's see. Yeah, this one right here, you can see this hole and that hole. And there's holes here and holes there. Weld tubes always have holes drilled into them. Let's see if I can find a better example of that. Here we go. So this is a weld tube out of a Weber. And you can see all those holes in the side of it. So that's what I'm going to cover in my next video. I'll explain what those holes are for and how they affect the fuel mixture of the carburetor. We'll save that one for another day. Thanks for watching.